You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor, and this is the Play Therapy Podcast, where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, we are diving into the phases of the child-centered play therapy model. So for those of you that have been with me from episode 1 and you've gone on this long journey, we are finally out of the foundational curriculum type of stuff, and now we're moving into some of the deeper things from in the playroom, bigger picture, expanded view, et cetera, et cetera. So very excited. If you're new, welcome. Please go back and catch up. It's really important that you start at the beginning and follow chronologically because they build off of each other. But for us to be moving into the phases today, that's really exciting because this is really helpful not only for us as clinicians to understand what point in the process the child may happen to be in at any given moment, but also for articulation to parents, because they need to understand not only what to expect at the beginning, but also where the child is going to be moving as you go through the phases. So we will talk about the phases of the model today, and we'll break them down, look at each one, unpack them individually. Next week, we're going to talk about the stages of the child-centered model. So sorry if that's confusing. Phases today, stages next week. And here's the very brief disclaimer. The phases that we're going to be talking about today are from Landreth. And I know that I don't always use Landreth's work. Sometimes I incorporate the Cochrane and Cochrane or the Van Fleet literature. So I just want you to be aware the phases that we're going to go over today are from Landreth. The stages that we're going to talk through next week are from Cochrane and Cochrane. I don't want you to really spend a whole lot of time making sense of that, other than I think they map really easily together. So I don't feel that they're in contradiction to each other. I think it's helpful to understand 4 phases and 4 stages and how there's some crossover and how those go as the child is progressing. So there's your disclaimer and teaser. We're going to do stages next week, but today it's phases. So the 4 phases of the child-centered approach are the initiation phase, the resistance phase, the work phase, and the termination phase. So I will unpack each of those individually and we'll kind of dive into each one. But keep in mind, all 4 phases are included for every child. And while it doesn't always map evenly across the time that they're in treatment, it is helpful to think about them as equal phases. So for example, in our center, we typically communicate to parents the 4 phases in terms of 4 5-week chunks, because historically the national average for the child-centered model has been a 20-week treatment process. So thinking in terms of a 20-week model, it's easy today to say with 4 phases that for the first 5 weeks we're in phase 1, and for the second 5 weeks we're in phase 2, etc. Now, here's a little side road that's important. I read an article in the last couple of weeks or so that they are now discussing a 30-week average. Not discussing, that has come out in literature that they are averaging the child-centered model to be around 30 weeks now. Now, I don't have time to get into why I think that has happened, but I have my theories. But for today's episode and staying focused, if we're assuming that the 30-week model is what we need to be expressing to parents now, then these 4 phases get a little bit longer. And it's not to say they're going to be 7.5 weeks long each now so that it's an even 30, but it's just helpful for your own understanding and for parents' awareness that there are 4 phases broken down into that 30 weeks, and to give them some frame of reference for length of time. So like I said, with 20 weeks, it was really easy, 4 or 5 week stages or phases, but then, with 30, it's a little more complicated. So just be aware of that. All right, so let's look at these 4 phases and then we'll kind of unpack them. So the initiation, the resistance, the work, and the termination. Initiation phase is essentially the child coming in, meeting you for the first time, and making sense of this whole thing. So they're trying to build rapport. They're trying to connect. They're trying to build relationship. They're figuring out what the expectations are, what the rules are, what this playroom is like. What do I do when I come in here? What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? What toys are there to play with? There's kind of just an initiation phase of everyone kind of finding their bearings. So we don't know a child the first time they walk into the room. They don't know us. So there's definitely the relational piece, but then there's also, they're just trying to figure out what a playroom is and what they're supposed to do and what they're allowed to do. So that is essentially the child's connection that is formed to the entire process, but specifically you as well. And so when you share this with parents, it's helpful for them to understand that it's going to take several weeks before they fully feel that there's a rapport and a bond and a connection established. You two are starting out as strangers. So even if you've talked with mom and dad, even if you've met with mom and dad and you have a sense of what the child is going through and what the child's personality may be like, and you can kind of conceive an idea of what this might be like. But for the child, they're walking into a strange place, into a strange room with a stranger. So it's not like as soon as they're in the room, all of a sudden this is all taken care of. There's an initiation phase because they have to get comfortable. They have to make sense of what this looks like. And specifically, they need to build that relationship with you. So it's really helpful that you understand that's taking place, but also that you articulate that to parents. So then once the initiation phase takes place, and we at the center typically explain to parents that for about 5 weeks or so, we're in the initiation phase. Because again, on the 20-week model, it's easy to break it down into 5-week chunks. So we want parents to understand it may take upwards of 5 weeks for that initiation phase. Some kids will immediately bond, immediately connect. They just dive in and they like you right away and whole hog, here we go. But then there are other children who are timid or reserved or don't trust easily, don't accept that they have to come. They aren't happy about being there. I mean, there's all kinds of barriers to the rapport that is built. So you have initiation phase that could take upwards of 5 weeks. And parents need to understand that because they bring their child to you one time and they expect miracles. They need to understand the child's not doing anything except trying to make sense of this new crazy thing that mom and dad are taking them to. So the initiation phase, we typically say is about 5 weeks. It can be shorter, but that is just kind of the helpful way that we help them understand a timeline. Okay, so moving into resistance, which is the second phase. This is essentially the point at which the bond and the rapport have been established. They feel comfortable. They're in there. They're ready to do what they need to do, but they hit a wall. And what I mean by that is every child reaches a point where they are aware of the work that needs to be done. They know what they're struggling with and what their issues are. And they therefore have to make a decision. Am I ready to do this? Am I ready to dive in? Am I committed and let's do it? Or do I not feel ready? Do I not feel comfortable? Do I not trust myself? And essentially, it's I don't want to deal with my junk because none of us do, right? Therapy is hard. And it's difficult to face walking through the muck and the mire and all of the nasty in your life. It's exhausting. It's mentally draining. It's physically draining. It's emotionally draining. It takes a lot of work. And kids essentially have to say, do I want to do this knowing what is going to come, which is a lot of hardship and difficulty? Or would I rather avoid it altogether and no thanks, I'm not going to do that after all. So they're essentially at a Y in the road. That's a really helpful way to describe it to families. So we're marching along this path and, to the right is all of the healing and change that needs to take place. And to the left is all of the resistance. And they reach this little fork and they say, okay, am I ready? Am I diving in? Are we jumping in the deep end here? Or do I really not want to do this? And do I not feel ready? And therefore I'm going to push it off as long as possible. Now, the great thing about therapy is they eventually do the work that they need to do. They cannot hold out forever. Therapy works even when we don't want it to, even when we think it won't. And so they will eventually give in and do their work because you can only resist for so long. However, it doesn't mean that resistance can't hang on for a while. So the resistance phase is essentially the child deciding, yes, I trust myself. Yes, I can do this. Yes, the therapist is going to help me. And we're in this together. And that's why the initiation phase is so important, because the child has to see you as an ally. They have to see you as their helper. They have to see you as the person that's going to serve as the therapeutic guide rails as they're going down this scary, dangerous, awful path. That's why that initial phase means so much, because they have to know that you're able to do this with them. So when they hit this resistance phase, they're wrestling with all of this. And once they realize, yes, I can do this. Yes, I trust myself. Miss Brenna's here. It's going to be fine. Then they dive into the work phase, which is phase 3. However, in painting the picture, we typically tell parents somewhere between the 6th and the 10th week, we will hit resistance. It typically only lasts a week or so. I mean, I think in extreme cases, maybe it was 2.5 or 3. It's really rare if you have a child that drags resistance out. But we have no way to predict when it's going to hit. So it could happen week 3, it could happen week 14. But the average in a 20-week model, remember, is somewhere between the 6th and the 10th week. I like to explain to parents that we don't know how resistance is going to manifest itself. In other words, I might only see it in the playroom. They might only see it at home. It may only come up at school. And what might resistance look like? They may refuse to do anything in the playroom. They may refuse to come back to the playroom. They may come back and act as if everything's fine, but then they are very aggressive and they try to hurt me or toys in the playroom. They might get extremely emotional. Everything just sets them off and they burst into tears, and parents are like, why are you so emotional? What is going on? They can get really quiet and just withdraw. They can be really dominant and power hungry. So there's all of these behavioral indications that a child is going through resistance, but there's no way to predict that. So sometimes I don't see it at all, but parents describe it, and vice versa. Sometimes parents don't see it and I see it in the playroom only. So that is the indication that the child is ready to move into the work phase. So once we get to the work phase, and mind you, that can be at week 6. If the child gets through initiation and resistance in the first 5 weeks, then we could be in work by week 6. So it is a linear process, but there is not a number associated with it. So work phase says, I'm ready. Here we are. Let's do what we need to do. So that is when you see the biggest shifts, the biggest movement, the biggest change, the biggest growth, the biggest healing. Now, it does not happen overnight, but there are micro indications. Oh, he didn't do that as long today. He didn't play that theme today. He was much more careful and regulated today. He didn't have chaotic play today. You will see subtle shifts. And that is reflective of the work phase, because they are addressing their issues, they know what they're struggling with, and they're moving forward in a healthy manner. So work phase, again, in a 20-week model is 11 through 15. However, we have many kids that are in work phase for a very, very long time. So sometimes work phase lasts 15 weeks. There's no way to predict that. It really depends on the severity of what the child's going through, how many issues they need to address, how much they trust themselves to deal with things. So there's a lot of factors that influence the length of the work phase. But in an ideal 20-week world, it's 11 through 15, but it's always much longer than 5 weeks. I mean, in very, very rare cases, you will have a work phase that short. But the work phase is typically the longest phase, and that's where the bulk of the healing takes place. So once the child is no longer introducing new themes, once the child is no longer bringing up new play, once they seem stable and calm and regulated, and everything has just kind of been status quo for a while, their work phase is wrapped up. So then it makes sense to move into termination phase, which is where everyone is on board, everyone is happy with the progress that's been made, and we're ready to start wrapping up. So termination phase is just as important as the other three. There are plenty of parents without a dialogue before therapy begins about the 4 phases of treatment and about the importance of each phase. I learned this the hard way. I didn't used to go through the 4 phases of treatment at the beginning of treatment. And then when parents were really happy with all the progress that had been made, they would just say, "Oh, we don't need to come anymore. Thanks so much. Something came up. We're going to do violin lessons now instead of you." And they would just stop coming. And that is so detrimental and so harmful and terrible in so many ways. And it used to break my heart for the child and for the progress that was made, for the relationship that we had established. They got no closure. I mean, oh my gosh, I could go on and on. So I have been very clear. All of the therapists at our center are very clear about the importance of the termination phase, because the child needs a healthy, happy goodbye. A child needs to know what to expect. They need to be able to have closure for the relationship that they've built with me, with their therapist. They need to prepare themselves to do things in the real world and handle things appropriately without therapy. Often they think therapy is the reason why they're better. Often they think the therapist is the reason why they're better. They need to mentally and emotionally prepare that they can handle this without therapy, because they've done the work, they've made the changes, but they sometimes associate it with me or the therapy process. So there's all of this deep work that's happening in the termination phase, and we can't downplay that, because if a child's just never brought to therapy again, they don't even get to say goodbye. They don't get to think about it, process it, wrestle with it. And often during the termination phase, you'll see regression. You'll see children revert back to old themes and old work and old play, because they're making sure that they know they can handle this. And they're a little bit worried and they're a little bit dysregulated. And so you will see them swing back because they're kind of assuring themselves they can handle it. So the termination phase in our center involves a countdown where we start telling the child, okay, I'm going to see you 4 more times. I'm going to see you 3 more times. I'm going to see you 2 more times. And we help them prepare for the goodbye, for the closure, for the trust and the acceptance that they can do this on their own. Now, when I say we terminate, I'm air quoting terminate, because we make it very clear that the child can always come back. So we say that to them. We articulate that it is not a forever goodbye. We say, you can always come back and see me. You just have to let mom or dad know, even if it's just for 1 visit. So it gives them the opportunity to believe that the relationship still exists, first of all. And second of all, if they need help and support and what we call booster sessions, they're able to come do that. And I can't tell you how many kids months later, years later, will say to their mom, "I want to go see Miss Brenna again." And parents can't believe it. They're like, "I can't believe they asked to come see you." And I'm like, they know they need it. They're very aware that things got better when they were playing. They associate that even at a very young level. They don't know why they're getting better and why playing is helping, but they know that it helps. So they will often, when they're emotionally struggling, when they're academically struggling, when they're relationally struggling, whatever's going on in their life, they'll say, "I want to go see Miss Brenna again." And sometimes it truly is 1 visit. I've had kids come back 1 time, and then mom calls a couple weeks later and says, "Well, that whatever that was, it fixed it because everything is completely good again." And I'm like, it was a refresher for what the child had already learned, already gained, already done. They just needed to be reminded that they had what it takes to handle whatever they're dealing with. And then sometimes it's a couple, 2 or 3, and then the child is fine. So it's very important to keep the termination phase loosely identified, because they need and want to come back often. And so it's not, "I'm never going to see you again." It's, "We're not going to schedule any more sessions for right now. And you can always come back if you want to." So Initiation, resistance, work, and termination phase. Those are the 4 phases. We talk about them with parents. We explain them to parents. We help parents navigate those. And it's helpful for us as clinicians, right? We need to be aware where the child is. Look, we know when a child's in resistance. We just don't always have a label for it. So now, if you've been one of those therapists that you watch it happen, but you never had a name, now you can say, okay, I know that we're in initiation phase. Oh boy, this is resistance week. Okay, here we are. Oh, well, now we're in work phase. Gosh, work phase has been really calm and stable. We can obviously move to termination. It's really helpful because it gives us the framework from which to operate and help parents understand where the child is too. So that is your overview of the phases of the child-centered model. I hope that's helpful. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, if you'd like me to feature one of your questions on air, if you've been dying to know something, please email me, brenna@thekidcounselor.com. And please make sure you go to playtherapynow.com if you would like to train with me in person in Tampa, if you would like to train with me remotely in virtual training groups. I have some options there. And the Play Therapy podcast exists to train up child-centered therapists to deeply understand what they're doing, feel confident in their work, and make the biggest impact on kids. And I just can't tell you how grateful I am for each of you. Thank you for emailing me and reaching out to me and letting me know that you're finding benefit from these episodes. This is such a special part of my week. So thank you for taking me along with you wherever you're going and spending time with me. Next week, we're moving into the stages, and those will be really fun to kind of map with what we just talked about today. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.